All right, so here we're going to talk a bit about the beginnings of the concept of the sacred, of this whole spiritual domain, and how it begins to evolve in prehistoric times. So, to begin with, what do we even mean by the word sacred? And we've talked about it in the past. It's a bit of an abstract term in order to be more inclusive, all right? Because when you're talking about religion, there are different concepts about the absolute, what constitutes ultimate reality. And religion in nature is focused on what constitutes the highest level, the ultimate level of reality or dimension in life. And for some religions, they are not God focused in the usual sense, like in Buddhism or Taoism, and other religions are God focused. So you have either more personalized conceptions of ultimate reality as a God or a divine being, supreme creator, this type of thing, or more in the sense of just reality itself as the Tao, as a flow of movement, as a process in some way. All right. So, in order to include all religions as such, we use the word the sacred in a more abstract, which is more of an abstract term. Now, it also, like as I highlight here in academia, it's come to mean this, that it's the opposite of the profane, of the ordinary, the mundane, what we think of ordinary reality, this everyday world that we live in, largely seen as material and physical, that the sacred is the other, something beyond, something greater, something higher, seen as something profound, deep, more real, and also awe-inspiring, and therefore it gets the designation of being holy. It's you are to have a reverential attitude towards it because of its higher status. Okay. So it's a concept that has evolved over time to then be rather, promoting this type of dualism, and it's largely a result of okay, in terms of also holy and profane, sacred and profane dialectic. It's also a result of how official religions have purposefully created certain holy places, certain holy objects, certain holy actions, religious rituals, that when you do certain gestures it has spiritual meaning, and they're set apart from more ordinary gestures. Okay. And therefore associated with them are various beliefs and of course adherents. There are the priests who are more holy than the layperson. So you get this kind of juxtaposition of the holy and the unholy in all kinds of ways. All right, hopefully that makes some sense. Okay. Now, a term just to introduce here is from Mircea Eliade, who was a very important scholar in the history of religion, probably the greatest of scholars so far we've seen, I think, globally, you'd say. He employs the term hierophany, and it refers to, and the meaning of it is a manifestation of the sacred. So the word here, as you can see, is a formation of the Greek adjective, all right, meaning the holy or the sacred, and a verb meaning to bring to light, okay, to reveal the holy. And so this is in a sense what we're looking at here is the various ways this what we call the sacred, or kind of this other dimension of reality, how it's shown up in human experience. Okay. And in a sense, it implies that there's some type of historical events at play here, because people throughout history have certain experiences, and therefore it's happening in a sense in historical time, right? And the accumulation of these experiences is then what has given birth to what we call religion and the various beliefs and practices that revolve around it, right? So these experiences are relevant to the individual at that point of time, but also they've come to have more universal relevance because it gets accumulated over time. And from these experiences, then, what does it tell us about reality, the nature of reality? What does it tell us, and how has it birthed the concept of divinity? Okay, concepts of spirituality. Okay, so the challenge is here for us is to trace a bit the history of these, how they may have evolved and changed and shown up over time, right? And then also, in what ways did they show up? How did they show up? Kind of what were the medium through which these experiences get channeled through? Okay, the modalities that are used for the holy to show up. All right. This is where we get then holy places, holy objects, holy people, and various things like that. They become the means through which the holy gets channeled through, or the spiritual gets channeled through. Okay. So that's how we then have access to it. Anyway, so this is just a bit of an intro, and just to set things in a bit of context here. Mm. So, as a whole, what we can generalize from human experience is that, first of all, as we've already mentioned, that the sacred is something that's experienced as something unique. Okay, it is something other, is of another dimension, another level of reality in some way. Okay, and that sense of otherness, distinctness, uniqueness is key. And secondly, okay, is that it usually shows up in either the form of a will encountering a consciousness. A persona is a term that I like to use, be it from literally God is creator of the universe type of idea to a fairy that shows up, or an elf, or some kind of spirit, right? Angel, demon, what have you. So there's a sense of consciousness, a being involved, and therefore will, right? And then the second aspect is energy, a sense of force, power, a special kind of energy around certain things or associated with that experience. Okay, those are the two key things, and I'm going to, work with those in future videos just to keep that in mind. But just for now, to kind of sum this up a little bit, people tend to, first of all, experience a sense of holy otherness. As I mentioned in a previous video, this is an idea from Rudolf Otto and the idea of the holy, that the key thing is a sense of awe, this encountering something powerful and mysterious that is kind of fascinating, is like, wow, this is something different. This is something higher, something more, something greater. But at the same time, a sense of fear. You need to have profound respect and reverence for this. Okay, approach it with some caution, right? So you get kind of that dance there, but that's what's all embedded in this idea of the holy other, or the sense of the sacred. And then it shows up in terms of the idea of consciousness. There's an intelligence somehow, in some way, a consciousness and awareness and intelligence in all of life. And so the term that anthropologists, when they study more indigenous people and tribal religions and whatnot, they've coined the phrase animism, meaning that everything is animated, is alive with a consciousness of some kind. And we see that throughout history, people have believed they could talk to the spirit of the bear, the spirit of plants, the spirit in the stone, and that you could have, stone medicine, plant medicine, animal medicine, for example, here, in North America with our First Nations people, right? But that everything is alive with a sense of consciousness, right? And therefore having will that you can dialogue with, learn from, have a relationship to. Okay, that's very key. Secondly is the concept of force, right? And the term that's used often in anthropology is mana. A belief that there are unseen, usually you can't see physically with your eyes, energies, but you can kind of feel them, right? You can, deduce they exist, you infer their presence because of the power that exists in certain places or objects, and they demonstrate themselves, all right, in some way. And this is what's so central to magic, okay, is there are these hidden forces and powers. And this energy can be transplanted, taken from one place to another, used, enhanced, weakened, directed, okay, for various purposes, all right? And again, we see this throughout history. So there'll be the creation of certain amulets and charms that you imbue with magic power to maybe protect you from harm, any kind of danger, or to bring you good luck, prosperity, or like love, like a love charm. And so as you see here to the right, this is something that's sold all over the place. You've got like the horseshoe combined with the idea of something that will protect you from the evil eye, from anybody cursing you, right? You can, I think, buy those on Amazon. So here is this key aspect of the sacred being experienced as some kind of special energy or force. Oops, hang on here. So now putting things in historical context here. Okay, I just want to get this out of the way. To go back to as far back as we can go, what's generally referred to, as the time of the simple hunter-gatherers of around 100 to 40,000 BC. So here, a key source that I've used, and let me just open this up again. Maybe you can't see it, is a classic work. I don't want to shift around here. But by Brian Hayden, A Prehistory of Religion, Shamans, Sorcerers, and Saints. Right? It's a really thick, heavy classic book that's used in anthropology of religion. And this is a quote from him. We find that in simple hunter-gatherers, the focus there is predominantly, in terms of religion, okay, on creator animal spirits. Right? That certain animals are responsible for the creation of life and the planet, so to speak, and that there also exist masters of animals. Right? We'll talk a bit more about this all later. And totemic animal ancestors, that the people themselves are descendants of certain animals, and therefore they form these clans. And we talked about that previously already in terms of totemism. That this is by far the most common expression in terms of pantheons, as collections of deities that we find among simple ethnographic hunter-gatherers. And often all three of these aspects are intertwined, okay? So this is kind of what we find predominantly in the very early stages. So we'll find in terms of the collection of deities, that's what a pantheon is. It's sort of like, a family of gods and goddesses, in later times, but it's sort of like a collection of beings that are seen as divine beings, so to speak. They were predominantly animal spirits. Okay, and they are almost like deities that show up in various stories, creation stories and myths and whatnot, like the raven, the coyote, the bear, the wolf. Many of them are creators, but they play powerful roles in human life and human experience and history, in terms of the various stories here. Often we have here totemic ancestral beings that families and lineages see themselves as being the descendants of, that they're derived from, the clan, the bear clan, the wolf clan, what have you. Okay, there's a sense that there's a spiritual essence of that totem animal that is contained within these descendants, that it's almost like the spirit of that animal is with them as a people. Okay, and that seems to be very much linked in with the idea of everybody having their power animal, a particular animal spirit that empowers you in life, will protect you in life, will guide you in life, and it's so important to have that connection in place. Right, and that's why they always had vision quests, that you make that connection, have that really solidly established as a young adult. And so it's held that if those animals would die out, so would the people, that they're spiritually connected. Their very life force as a people is tied in with the spirit of that animal. And so it's so important to keep that relationship and that kinship, that connection going, or else the people would cease to exist. Now, where animals are more important for subsistence, subsistence, is that hang on here. The more animal deities existed. Hang on here. I need to read my own. Sometimes I kind of fall around like, okay, what do they all say here? Where animals are more important for subsistence, the more the animal deities existed. That's right. Okay, that's a key thing here. Because they're hunter-gatherers and primarily their food comes from the hunting of animals, along with, gathering berries and, whatever. That's where you see animal deities more prevalent. Okay, they are more in existence here. There is no mother goddess in this early stage. That comes much later with the development of agriculture, as we'll see. Okay, but at this point, the deities are primarily animal in nature in this early period. So here's just a little bit of the master of animals concept, and this is kind of a bit tied in with some of Plato's ideas, really. A sort of animal is a type that, like, there's a sense like an overlord of this animal, that, say, the bear spirit, that there is the master of the bears who exists on the spiritual plane that rules over all the bears on earth and is responsible for their well-being and responsible for their coming to this world. It's almost like they're the source of the bear. Okay, and they provide the souls for the animals to be reborn again on earth. And the master animal, like the bear spirit, so to speak, as the master of the animals, the master of the bears, is can withhold animals from being accessible to people. Okay, can kind of withhold that access. So it's so important to have a good relationship here with the master of the animals in order to ensure that, well, if this bear was killed for food or whatever, then another bear would be reborn, and the cycle, the life cycle would keep on going. But the belief is that there's the origins for all bears exist on a higher plane, on a higher dimension, like a type of bear spirit that exists that is responsible for bringing each individual bear to earth. Okay. So tied in with this is the animal that's, tied in with that is often then sacrificed and eaten, and but with prayers and rituals involving that the spiritual essence of that bear that was eaten, or whatever the animal is, it would return back to the realm from which it came, so that it could once again return in the future in a new body, right? So it'd have an ongoing life cycle. So it's really quite interesting. You could almost think this is the very beginnings of a concept of reincarnation, except of course that language isn't used. Hang on here, yeah. Well, we also find at times, not as often, but at times, is a connection with the sun or moon, more so the sun than with the moon, that can take on a role as a deity in some hunter-gatherer societies. Sometimes the sun was associated with particular animals, such as an eagle, a lion, a bull, or a bear. And you'll see this kind of played out very much so throughout all of history. But there's just an image of the sun linked in with a lion-type spirit. And so these sorts of interconnections are very common. Whoops, where am I here? Okay, there we go. This moves so quickly. Well, then, at around 40,000 BC, okay, we have then a gradual shifting from simple to more complex hunter-gatherers, okay, to more complex hunter-gatherers, where in the simple hunter-gathering society, people just foraged for food. They would just hunt, gather berries and whatnot. There was no private ownership of resources. Okay, that's a key thing. There's no private ownership. It was always collectively shared with the tribe, so to speak. But then it starts to shift where private ownership of some of the resources start to take place. Okay. And once there's private ownership of some resources, then that's where we have the beginning of sort of stratification in society, so on a social level, between those who economically are wealthier versus those who aren't. Okay, and a bit of a split starting to occur, and a weakening of more of this sense of collective identity. And this comes about largely because of new technology. The ability to harvest seasonally massive amounts of food and then storing it for long periods of time is a key aspect here. All right. So it's not just about getting enough food for the day, but actually being able to store it for longer periods of time. So once you have the ability to develop here, like, for example, doing a lot of salmon fishing, but then smoking and drying them and storing them to get through a certain season of time, and that you could potentially create a surplus that you then can trade for other goods. This is what starts to happen here, okay, with developing these kinds of technologies. And then you have the very beginnings of certain people, certain families becoming wealthier than others, right? Wealthier than others. So this is a key factor, and we'll see how that's going to play out here in a bit. Other changes that can result at this time, it seems that with this shift, with increased food storage like this, leading to wealth for some people, and therefore leading to social stratification as a result, right? You get the beginning of class distinctions due to private ownership. This begins here and then will continue further down amongst various groups, whether they become horticulturalists down the road or become pastoral nomads. That is, and we'll see that there'll be those who they'll settle in certain regions along rivers, okay, along some kind of river valley or along rivers, where they develop agriculture and stay settled in like little cities, villages that become cities eventually, versus those where their main food supply remains to be cattle and sheep and things like that. And they are always on the move of moving the herds to new grasslands, right, to feed the herd. So they're more nomadic in lifestyle instead of being settled as the agriculturalists would be. Okay. So you'll find that this is what's going to evolve further down the road here. But what we do find is in cave art now seems to start here once more food is stored and wealth is acquired. And apparently, archaeologists think that a lot of the cave art is tied in more with rituals for the elite. Okay, not for just the common person or the every individual, but just more for those who are the wealthier class, so to speak, those who are more in power and wealthy. Okay, this is something that will show up a bit more here in a bit. Ritual feasting also seems to appear in this time here, once we get more acquired wealth like this and food storage and whatnot, where an animal will be sacrificed as food for the community, but it's also seen as a sacred ritual that is going to be tied with a display of wealth and authority. Okay, with the elaborate ceremony and costumes and music, ritual, dance. And this is something that can only be done in a very stable society that has resources. They're not people always on the hunt and on the move and being very vulnerable to, whatever the weather will hold up for them. Excuse me. It requires stability. So these feasts become more elaborate and it indicates further social stratification between the wealthy versus those who aren't. Okay, an example of this, and this is sort of a picture of the potlatch done in here in the Northwest Coast, which would involve lavish feasting and the giving of gifts in the community. So in this very early prehistoric time period here, we have, in terms of cave art, increasing artwork done, very elaborate in certain areas, indicating that this work, because of the difficulties done, like some of these caves are so inaccessible and so difficult to access, and it would take so much to have done what some of the cave art would entail. That's why they think it was reserved for the elite, all right, the leading members, who engaging in whatever rituals were done as a part of this cave art, that it was in order to acquire powerful spirit allies, right? Maybe connecting with power animals in a special way, but really getting spiritual power through these rituals that then solidified their base of authority. Okay, it empowered them in this world. So it seems there was a lot of initiation of children, of elite children, that would, because it seemed that they'd, I don't know, this is what's theorized, and I don't know that much about it, tell you the truth, but this is what different scholars think, that they were generally more severe and longer than others, and it was held just to be so important for them to really tap into these powerful spiritual allies. Okay. So you'll find many hand and footprints of children in these caves, and that's just an example of one of them. All right. Here's another picture in terms of cave art. Animals portrayed here seem to float. They're not at all in a natural context. It's not like they're, let's, try to paint a picture that looks like in a natural setting. No, it's a very, very evident that they're done for ritual purposes to create through the imagery a sense of a spiritual reality, connecting with the spiritual reality behind these animals. They're connecting with the spirit of these animals. Okay. And so you'll find, though, quite a bit of a blending. A horse with two horns, sort of somewhat semi-mythical creatures, a blending of human and animal is very, very common, right? And I can't remember, yeah, here, it's right here on this page, okay. And so this is what's called therianthropism, where you have imagery of half human, half animal. And there's a lot of that shows up in history. Excuse me. But they tend to be mostly male. You don't find females that often here at all in terms of this kind of imagery of blending animal with human. But what's been interesting is amongst the South African Bushmen, and because they've been, certain Bushmen have been living quite isolated from the influence of modernity. And they've conveyed the idea that they believe that the rock walls in these caves are kind of a boundary between this world and the spirit world. where this animal spirits live. And when they paint on the wall, they claim that what they're trying to do is they're calling forth these spirit animals to come into this world through the artwork, through their painting in the wall. That's how they're entering into and accessing the spirit world and calling forth these animal spirits to come. And so perhaps that's what we can project backwards in time to think that, that's really reflective of a very ancient belief. And with that, I think it's kind of tied in with they're going into an altered state of consciousness as they would do that, and to induce these sort of visionary experiences. Okay, so it seems to be tied in with that. Oops. And so here's just some examples where we see this all over the place. Let me just remove this here. You have some examples of these kind of blending of human animal figurines. I mean, it's so prevalent throughout Egyptian deities. Okay, you've got there the crocodile god Sobek, who was the god of fertility, vegetation, and life, who created the Nile from his sweat. There's Horus, represented as a man with the head of a falcon, also wore a double crown, the god of the skies. You have things like the Sphinx type imagery, the pharaoh's head on the lion's body. But over here to the left is, I think that goes back to the Akkadians or else the Sumerians, where again, a blending of, is that horse, it seems, with wings and the head of a human. Again, kind of a blending. And those are above our prototype images of Shiva, of who is the horned one, surrounded by the animals. And again, that's something very interesting. You see that throughout Europe, and we'll see that more down the road. And it's so prevalent in sort of more pagan kind of traditions, but it is really quite worldwide, these sort of connections between human and animal, human and animal. So let me see here. Okay. So another shift that happens that impacts the future of religion in all kinds of ways. Oops, there's a typo though. Initially, it's probable, okay, probable that ecstatic experiences could be had by all, but is held, the experts on this, because this is not my area really, is this prehistoric religion, seem to hold that those with wealth sought to restrict access to ecstatic contact with supernatural forces in order to claim and hold for themselves, all right, privileged divine directives. This is a huge thing. This is where, the elites would want to kind of harbor, maintain and control supernatural powers, wisdom, strength, what have you, for themselves over and above the masses. Okay. And so we have pretty much from day one, the relationship, this dance between politics and religion taking place. Because religion or spirituality or whatever you want to call it, the sacred, is a source of power. And because of that, the kings and future rulers are going to make sure they want to be empowered by these higher powers. It's going to be a big thing that plays throughout time. Another possible shift that happens here is, and I'll just reduce myself again here, the number of wives and children become a very important, valuable resource. It allows for a greater amount of food to be processed and stored because you've got more labor here, labor available. And that will lead to then, of course, a surplus, right? Surplus of wealth. And that then may have led, one aspect that may have led to a raising of the status of women, because they're the ones that, give birth to all these babies, and therefore a concern over fertility to make sure that they are fertile and can, bring forth many children. So goddess figurines start appearing. And also show up like in terms of caves, where you'll have representations of a phallic image, a phallus from the stalagmites that come down, and then in the wall and be tied in with indents in the wall that would be almost like the vagina of a woman. That seems to be the earliest indications and references to kind of an interest in fertility here between male and female, right? And that is having some kind of religious meaning. Another aspect that comes into play here in terms of a shift is the ending of the Ice Age. The change in terms of the climate, that the raising of sea levels, with the meltdown of the Ice Age taking place, resulted in vast grasslands being replaced by forests, and that the large migratory herds of animals begin to dwindle in Europe, and many animals become extinct at this time. And people then start looking for other ways to produce food surplus, perhaps even migrating to other areas as well, and spreading, various things like I'm wondering about the Indo-European tribes. And so for other ways to provide food. So the harvesting of grains, settling in regions, these sorts of things start to happen. Large scale fishing starts, the bow and arrow is invented. And now we find in this context, structures that indicate a commitment to ancestral cults, practices of devotion to your ancestors, right? And the importance of ancestral lineage comes into play. So in the Neolithic period, generally we find here we have the beginnings of the domestication of plants and animals, and agriculture getting developed, taking place here in the Near East here around 10,000 BC, spreading into Europe along the river valleys and also along the Mediterranean coast. And ownership of resource locations becomes more important. Who's dominant in particular area where all the fish are or where the crops are grown. Okay, so here you get more of ownership over locality as opposed to just a food surplus. Okay, food surplus, because there's more of a dependence on that locality for the food, as opposed with herds, they roam from A to B to C, right? And so their herds of animals aren't so tied in with locality. It's always on the move. Now that with this taking place, then ownership seems to be tied in more with ancestry and having a lineage authority, that this family line has been here the longest in this place. And therefore, you need to remember your ancestors. And you do that through always honoring your dead ancestors. And that seems to come into place now. I don't have any picture that I could find that, I've got sketches in some books, but I don't really have pictures I could find online here. So this is, of course, more of a modern picture of a Chinese tradition of honoring your dead ancestors. But this, as you know, throughout the world, this becomes very much the norm all over the place to honor your dead ancestors. And we're losing it in modern times. Okay, we're losing it these days. But in terms of the West, we've lost it. But it's still very dominant in other cultures. So ancestral worship, well, to call it that, is honoring your dead ancestors, really. It's not just worshiping them when we think of worshiping a god, really. It's honoring your dead ancestors, and retaining that lineage is something that becomes very important. Dead ancestors could provide advice, guidance, claims of authority, resolve disputes, mete out justice supernaturally. And this is something, if you did I used to show a video in terms of Eastern religions, in terms of China, and how in a Taoist temple, there was some kind of an issue and the people needed advice. And so they consulted the spirit of the dead father, or maybe it's a grandfather, but a male figure who was the head of the home, to get advice. And they did it through a divination technique, very similar to the Ouija board, okay, to try to get an answer, some kind of resolution of an issue. Right? And so this is where this sort of thing can happen. To deal with issues. And then also the belief develops in various cultures that perhaps, a grandparent could reincarnate in a child. And so your lineage is very, very important, the sense of ancestral lineage. And tied in also, as I mentioned already, with property and ownership and whatnot. And then, of course, it just only makes sense that matters of marriage becomes important. Who marries who? What kind of family lines are coming together in terms of their lineage, right? There's going to be an exchange of wealth and various agreements regarding ownership that will come about through marriage. So you can really see this being played out in India with the caste system that develops there, right? It very much reflects some of these very ancient kind of practices, okay? Now, none of this seemed to have existed in the very early hunter-gatherer periods, we think, okay? But we do find then in more complex hunter-gatherers and the beginnings of agriculture and all that going on here in the Neolithic period, that we find structures, small structures, that seems to be that it was specially dedicated to honoring the dead, honoring your dead ancestors, and therefore had restricted access. It wasn't just for anybody and everybody, but restricted to a family line. Okay. And usually they were the powerful families, all right, those that were of great power. Oops, am I there? Okay. I'm going to just move myself here all together. Hopefully you can see this okay. So we find here, excuse me, at around 7000 BC, there's a really amazing site that got dug up, Catalhayuk in Turkey. And they found what seemed a pretty interesting, complex little village or whatever you want to call it, with a temple. Well, a temple is a rather grand word, but some kind of a building that seemed to be dedicated to deities, and where they found an image here of like a goddess type figurine, excuse me, where she's seated there, and she looks like she's a woman. And there's other indications here at that place where something to represent the womb, and something else that, to represent the female side, and then with that to represent the male side, the horns of a bull were very prevalent there, and they almost were like male and female, god and goddess enthroned in some type of way. Okay. And also tied in with the animals, that the animals are from them, they're connected with the animals, very much prevalent throughout. And so we have here at this time of seeing the beginnings of a type of duality of male, female, god, goddess idea, right? And also this time more and more we see the goods buried in the graves of people who have died, that we see more weapons put in there along with items of wealth. Okay, and it seemed to be kind of this connection between human power and divine power. We get those kind of links showing up more and more. Whoops. And so there's increasing evidence of fertility kind of symbolism that indicates fertility rituals, okay, and a greater focus on these sorts of things in terms of religious rites that would have been done. Okay, they become more and more widespread here in the Neolithic period, probably because of the need for having many children and large families for labor purposes, all right, for food production. And then also an emphasis on the lineage, the family line. To be wealthy, to have a healthy family line, you need many children and be a robust kind of family line. So goddess images appear all kinds of ways. It seems that the earth being fertile, the fertility of the earth becomes more of a concept here. Females are increasingly rarely associated with animals. That becomes more the male role, that the males are the hunters. They are the ones that go and hunt the animals. And so male type imagery is often associated more so with the animals than it is with the goddess type imagery. Okay. And so we get phallic symbols coming into play here increasingly, and they are also seen as a sign of fertility, prosperity, good luck. Okay, here's some images of goddesses, and I'm going to just do this again here. So, for example, to the right there comes from the Mesopotamia region. You have Ishtar is represented by the 8-pointed star up there. And then the father god Sin is the moon crescent, and the solar disk there in the right upper right corner there, right on the right, is the brother Shamash. And then below here is again Ishtar, but represented more with wings and arrows. I think that's her. It's kind of hard to tell there, all this different kind of imagery, but it's associated with Ishtar. Okay, the goddess again. So she becomes prevalent. And the term Ishtar, Inanna, I think amongst the Akkadians, we have here another image of her, Ishtar. Okay, again with wings here, and again standing on the animal. But you can even see here, see she's got wings, but she also, her feet are almost like that of a eagle or something, right? And associated with owls, but yet standing on, I don't know if they're lions, okay? And even on her head there, I don't know if that's just her hair or perhaps even snakes, because that will come into the picture down the road as well. And then to the right, Esther, a Germanic goddess of fertility. And so Ishtar, also known as Astarte, becomes a kind of, then becomes associated with Venus later on, and as a deity, a goddess of love and fertility, but also powerful in these phrases. And you can see here with Esther associated with the spring and fertility. So you see rabbits and birds and fairies and, associated with the spring, that everything comes alive in the spring is associated with Esther. And that's where you get Easter from, right? To celebrate spring and Easter egg with fertility. So these are all very ancient ideas that go from the past to the present, right, over time. And a lot of bull imagery, prevalence of the bull. This starts to begin and expands over time, and it's still even very present in all kinds of ways today. So we find increasing imagery of bulls in various sanctuaries, cave art. It's associated very much with masculine power, okay, masculine fertility in many cultures, especially Near Eastern cultures, right? The Sumerian sky god was a bull, also Adad, the Akkadian storm god, Zeus, amongst the Greeks, Dionysus, all in a bull form. Often referred to as the bull being from heaven and later on linked with the sun, as it is in the Mithras cult, and I'll show that in the next video. But even here to the right, okay, the warrior, sun, and bull gods of later time, they all have their beginnings here Neolithic, and they tend to kind of merge a bit here and there. Okay, so to the right is the Egyptian deity Apis, represented as a bull, but with the disk of the sun on his head. In the Mediterranean regions, very widespread still, the bull image, and even still being played out in terms of bullfights in Spain. And wine is called bull's blood. Oops. So here's some more imagery of, again, the upper right corner there in the blue and gold is Sumerian image of a bull. Down below here is Akkadian, which is, they're close to the Sumerian time frame. And we already saw this picture a bit of, again, half human, half bull type figure. And then there's more of a associated with, you see this often in Mediterranean type art, but it goes with the Minoans, which is also, similar time range really, of leaping on the bull. And it seemed to indicate certain kind of rituals of playing with a bull that may be the ancient roots behind a bullfight. And then here in Roman times, what developed was the Mithras cult, the slaying of a bull in ritual, and sharing the banquet of the slaying of the bull with the sun god. Okay, over to the right. So you get this link of the bull and the sun. Excuse me. Oops. Oh, and here's some more imagery. Excuse me. Half human, half bull. In terms of Greek mythology, the Minotaur. And then you'll see that showing up. This is what you get in our video games and movies and things like this. But it goes way back in terms of ancient roots. Okay. So what we also have happening here is the beginnings of a separation between public religious rituals to serve the larger public versus private religious practice, cult. Okay. Evidence suggests a separation between the rituals done by the elite, of the elite, for the elite, with its small structures of devotion to their particular lineage, privately done for those who are in power, for those who are wealthy, versus the ordinary people, those of individual families of the lower class, so to speak, where they had more of a domestic kind of practices of small clay figurines of animals, maybe fertility symbols to attract desired spiritual qualities to their homes and life and whatnot. And it seemed that increasingly the ecstatic states for having access to people like the shaman of old, who is able to journey to the world of the spirits, who is able to get visions, see things in the future, do rituals of healing and magical power, right? Increasingly, that's sort of reserved for those who are in power. They're the ones who have direct access to those guys who can do that for them. Okay. So you find this kind of bifurcation happening between the religion of the masses versus those who are in power. And this will show up in terms of, in Chinese, the Shang dynasty, the oldest dynasty really in China, in a sense. Over the Egyptian, this is where we start getting into the temple state religions, which we'll talk about here soon. With the Egyptian pharaohs and whatnot, so that the priests that were doing rituals for them, it's exclusively for those who are in power, not for the masses. So there's a totally different ballgame for the masses. Okay. So you get this sort of division happening. Okay. We also find increasing conflict. There's more war and conflict over, again, space and control, because again, we're now getting more into politics and power. So we find more arrowheads and daggers, evidence of conflict, violent deaths, that people were killed in battle as opposed to just some kind of a natural death, right? And we also have the rise of human sacrifices in terms of war victims that are put to death. And they were offered as sacrifices to the gods in various ways. Right? This appears where there are more pronounced differences in wealth and power. And we also find increasingly evidence of child sacrifice. And this is happens all over the world. You'll find that. Okay. Here is just, I think these are both pictures, because again, it's hard to find pictures of everything that I want. Going in terms of some amazing finds that have been found in Peru. Literally hundreds of children being sacrificed, and some of the skulls there, and you could see some of them almost mummified in a position here. This is a child that's kind of huddled up, was all bound up like this, and was put to death. And yeah, and we find that child sacrifice was done to guarantee blessings on the home, on the family, on the country, on the king, on whoever. All right. It brought protection and blessings and fertility. Okay. Yeah. And so we even see this in the story of Abraham willing to sacrifice Isaac. Okay. Yeah. There's a lot of evidence of this sort of thing happening all over the place. So then we also have in this time period an greater emphasis on fertility of the crops and rituals done in that regard. And so just an example of that, we know, in Europe, in terms of pagan traditions and peasant kind of belief, was that the grains actually have a soul. And when the grains would be harvested, it's like the spirit of the grains retreats, okay, to the rest of the crop. So a certain amount of it is chopped up and brought in, harvested. The spirit has left the that which just got killed and has moved into the rest of the crop, in a sense, until you get to the very last stalk, okay, or sheaf, containing the last few grains of that whole crop. All the spiritual essence of that whole crop is in that one sheath, okay, and it's and tied in with this is evidence of human sacrifice to enhance the fertility of the land for the next season, along with copulation, sexual rituals in the fields to ensure the fertility of the land. And people then have made corn dollies, which you'll see in the next picture, for prosperity. So it's very much tied in with fertility and prosperity and more abundance. Okay. And it seems that the concept of reincarnation might be that eventually will evolve in history. It seems to be tied into the idea that, as we saw earlier with the master of animals and animal spirits kind of being reborn, coming to earth, and likewise with the crops, is like it's held. The reason why there's life on earth here is because their spirits have come to earth, that there's a soul spirit that is what makes everything alive. And when it leaves, when there's death, it returns to the other world and eventually will come back again. All right. And if that happens to nature, in terms of this cycle of death and rebirth in nature, perhaps that also happens for humans. So here's just a picture of a corn dolly. Okay. where they just, all the last few sheets here are combined together to make up a corn dolly that is believed to bring extra prosperity, health, and good luck. Oops. Now we also have developing at this time. I'm going to be ending soon on this video here. Oops, what time is it here? Okay, good. Our New Year rituals. And it seems that since there's this sense of renewed birth of plants and animals, of death and rebirth, right? Then it's held that the world as a whole is reborn and recreated from year to year to begin anew. And so special rituals tend to be associated predominantly more with the spring equinox, okay, in terms of the birthing that takes place in the spring, but also at times a little bit later, like in the dark of winter, right, where we're at that shift as we do like at Christmas time, the winter solstice, where we come to the darkest night of the year, the longest night of the year, I should say, and then the light gradually increases. So that's like a turning point from going into the winter and then leaving the winter behind. So we find special rituals done and for associated with rebirthing, okay, of the spring equinox, but also a lot tied in with this moon when you go from entering into a new moon, and it comes a full moon and the cycles of the moon, but also the cycles of the sun, all right. And with these rituals to celebrate the creation of the world, and therefore you get the image of often coming from a cosmic egg in many cultures. Just like a chicken comes from the egg, is like the earth came forth from an egg. All right. And with it are various rituals involved. And it's held that one thing is that you'll find various rituals that kind of celebrate the things coming into chaos, the world kind of coming into an end and collapsing into chaos, but then it's going to be reborn into renewed order, a renewed structure. All right. And you'll find this in all kinds of rituals. And the one that I'm most familiar with is coming from India, with the sacrifice of the god Purusha, which I think is on the next slide. I'm pretty sure it is. But whoops, let me just see here. Oops. No, it's not on this side. Okay, it's going to come down the road. You'll see that. But here is a picture of the Roman festivity of Saturnalia. And that's associated with celebrating the god and therefore the planet Saturn and its renewal, its rebirth, right? And that's generally around in Christmas season in the winter, around the winter solstice. But a part of that entailed that before the birthing of the new, you have full permission to go into chaos. And you have someone who's appointed of the Lord of Misrule, who has the right to actually go crazy, pretend to be what they're not, pretend to be the emperor when they're just a mere peasant. And you have these kinds of chaotic festivities. It's sort of like all rules can be broken during this time. Chaos is allowed for a little time. And then before there is the restructuring, the reintroduction of order and the rebirthing, the renewal of things for the next coming year. And I can't help but think, and you'll find, especially in European societies, there'll be various rituals like this that'll show up. And it seems that it just becomes a real stress relief for people who have been so oppressed by rules, by the upper classes, by having to conform to the status quo, that for a time period, they have full permission to break all those rules. And it's usually done in fun, but you have permission just to go wild for a bit. And I think it's a nice safety release valve for humanity. So as a bit of just a sum up here so far, what we see increasingly is that there's a monopolization of spiritual power, okay? We see over time that there's an economic surplus that develops, and with that a rise in political power. So there's always a link between economics and politics. It gets linked to wealth. A greater emphasis gets placed on the ancestry, on the lineage of the elite, right? And then even, when you think of what all goes on today, talk about the global elite, those who are in power, the royal class, the upper class. You get this link all the time, throughout history, between wealth and power, with religion supporting it. To support that power, there begins then the restricted access to ecstatic states, the rise of a priesthood, the beginnings of what will evolve into the city state kind of temple based religions, we'll talk about soon here, that we find with the earliest civilizations. Okay. But what also will occur here, which we'll talk about in the next video, is the influx of Indo-European nomadic tribes, often known as the Aryans, and different elements there that are brought into the picture here in the history of religion. Okay, so that's that for today.